So the question is then, are eyes still evolving? So the thing with evolution is it never ends. And we're always going to adapt to our environment, we're always going to be subject to genetic drift, and we're always going to have changes throughout the gene pool, the gene process, the reproduction process. But it's important to remember that it's not this constant strive for perfection. There's a lot of genes that we pass on that don't give us advantages. There's a lot of conditions that are genetic that wouldn't allow us to survive in our normal, in our original environment. But because of the way that we've evolved the environment to us, to our needs, they don't sort of pose that same threat as they would have done. But we're never going to stop evolving. There's always going to be change as environments and as the gene pool changes as well. So currently, there's around about 350 hereditary eye conditions that can be passed through genetics. So some, for example, even looking at the 7 just for albinism. So yeah, quite a lot. That's just the A's. I won't go through the whole alphabet because it takes too long. But lots of different genes, and all these genes can then be passed on through the reproductive process, and these conditions can then be inherited. But again, none of these conditions are going to give us any kind of advantage. They're not going to give us any kind of survival advantage over our competitors, but we're not as impacted by that as we would have been at one point. But the present situation is that there's always going to be internal and external factors that contribute to which genes are turned on or off. So these can be things like gender, environment. Obviously with gender, males have got XY chromosome, females have got 2X chromosomes. So where the gene is located can determine how more likely that is to be passed on, etc. Chemicals, temperature, all of these things play a part, and this is what's known as the kind of the phenotypic effect. So the effects that these environmental changes have on our genes that cause them to change and cause them to mutate through that evolutionary process. And when we think of a lot of conditions that we see in practice, there's always risk factors, and there's a lot of risk factors that we relate to ethnicity. And in terms of genetics, in terms of what actually makes us ethnically different, there's very few genes involved in that process. So we think of the most obvious one is skin colour when we determine race. But skin colour itself is only affected by a handful of genes, which we have sort of slightly different amounts of. But in terms of the genes that we've got in common, there's obviously millions and millions of genes that we all share. So it's in terms of what actually impacts this, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, it's more to do with the sort of the geographic location. It's more to do with the fact that genes have been kept within a certain population rather than people of a certain colour or people of a certain ethnicity are more prone to a condition. And one good example of this is something like sickle cell anemia. So most people, I'm guessing everyone's heard of sickle cell anemia, haven't they? And if we were to say who's more affected by sickle cell anemia, what would we say? What race is more commonly? Yeah, so it's generally found amongst Afro-Caribbean populations, but it's actually an adaptation to cope with malaria. So it was actually, you can find it in places like Greece, you can find it in the Indian subcontinent. Wherever there's prevalence of malaria, you'll also find sickle cell anemia. And it's just a way of combating the malaria itself. So it's, again, an evolutionary advantage at that point, but then obviously it's developed into something that causes issues today. And this is what we mean then by genetic drift. So genetic drift is the change in a frequency of an existing gene variant in a population due to random chance. So genetic drift may cause gene variants to disappear completely and thereby reduce genetic variation. And it can also cause initially rare alleles to become much more frequent and even fixed. So if we have a little look at a common condition that's definitely affected by genetic drift that we're all going to see a lot more of now, we can look at myopia. So according to Brian Holden, ultimately genetic susceptibility and environmental changes have likely worked in combination to produce the greater prevalence of myopia observed today. So it's that genetic impact, the environmental changes that we've definitely noticed over the past sort of 10 years or so with the switch to more screen time, etc. and these have played a part in the evolutionary process, and we're starting to see more myopic patients now. So we know that if we have one myopic parent, the risk increases by 3 times to have a myopic child. 2 myopic parents, and we have a risk factor of 6 times. Children with highly myopic parents are also found to progress faster, both spherically and axially. And there's been 25 locations on the alleles, on the chromosomes, where genes that are associated with myopia have actually been identified and found. So this has all come from myopiaprofile.com. So according to Morgan et al., so myopia is etiologically heterogeneous because both environmental and genetic factors play important roles in myopia. So when we say it's heterogeneous, it means it's got several root causes. We know there's genetic causes and we know there's environmental causes. Combining those together, it's going to create a much more higher chance of myopia developing. And to date, there's more than 100 genes and over 20 chromosomal locations that have been identified to be associated with myopia. So there's a lot going on there, isn't there? And just because these genes have been identified as being associated with myopia, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily directly responsible for or solely responsible for the cause of myopia. So genes can have multiple different influences on different parts, different organisms. But like I said, we've got 100 genes in total, over 100 that will actually contribute towards myopia, which is quite a lot really, isn't it, when you think about it. But like I say, genes have multiple functions. So for example, the genes that are involved with the creation of the big toe. So the big toe, the development of the big toe was quite an important step in us becoming bipedal, being able to walk on our hind legs. But it's also, the same genes are also found to be in charge of developing thumbs. And having thumbs has been like a massive advantage to us, hasn't it? Because without thumbs, we wouldn't be able to use smartphones, we wouldn't be able to play on the Xbox and stuff like that. So it was quite an evolutionary advantage to develop those thumbs. And that's just a snapshot of the locations there. So I'll show you each of these little triangles. Those are the different locations which those 100 genes have been located at as part of that chromosome. So again, it's this genetic drift. It just plays a massive, massive impact. And like I say, evolution is change, it's not necessarily improvement. So although these evolutionary changes are happening, particularly with myopia and other conditions, they're not providing us any kind of advantage, they're not improving us as such. But it's that genetic drift, it's the environmental factors, the phenotypic factors that are triggering these genes and producing these changes over time. And like I say, we're not as impacted by natural selection because we've shaped the environment to us, so we're not as at the whim of nature now. So it's a lot easier for these conditions to be passed on. And just touching on myopia, so historically, the prevalence of myopia was quite an indicator of socioeconomic status. So you tend to find that more affluent patients would have been myopic because over time it would have been more affluent people that would have been spending more time reading, more time indoors, etc., more time studying, whereas people from less sort of affluent areas would have mainly been outdoors, working outside and that kind of thing. However, now, with myopia control methods, you're probably going to start to notice that it's the more affluent kids that are going to be able to access myopia control methods. And with the change in the way that the environment is now, with more kids from non-affluent areas spending a lot more time on screens and stuff like that, you'll probably find a much more of a development within non-affluent areas. The question is though, as we go through the generations, will those kids that have gone under myopia management and become less myopic later in life, will then those figures as to how much the prevalence of myopia being passed on, the extreme of high myopia being passed on, are we going to start to see that sort of start to abate as well? So we don't know what's going to happen in that sense. So it'll be interesting to see future generations how much of an impact myopia management has now, but also in terms of future generations, whether that affects the genetic drift as well. So this all comes down to what was known as the selfish gene theory. And this was published in 1976, and there's been a lot of research, a lot of extra studies done into it since then, and it's just kind of strengthened up the initial theory behind it. So when we talk about theories as well, so the word theory is often misunderstood. So we talk about the theory of evolution, the selfish gene theory, etc., quantum mechanics theory, all these different kind of theories. And the key thing to remember with a scientific theory is we're never saying that something is absolute fact, but theory is as good as it gets. So theory doesn't mean that this is what we think or this is what we sort of hypothesize. A theory is this is what is best supported by the current evidence available to us now. But should new evidence emerge, then obviously we can change our position going forward and adapt to it. But it's an important sort of caveat when we think about that word theory. So the selfish gene theory basically states that it's the natural selection process in the evolution of living beings is not about making the species, community or group secure, it's about making the individual secure, and the individual is merely a vehicle for its genes. So it's not the species that needs to adapt and to survive, it's the genes themselves, and it's the genes that force these changes to give their host the means to survive and the means to reproduce and adapt in that sense. So Richard Dawkins, who was the author of The Selfish Gene, who led that study, he said, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." So it's all about the genes, it's all about what the genes are controlling, what the genes are passing on to us. So let's have a look at the future then. So how will our eyes evolve in the future? So we don't really know what our environment's going to look like, do we? We've adapted to this kind of metropolis, this urban environment. Is that going to change in the future? The way that architecture is done, the way that cities are planned, we are going to probably see changes in the environment, in where we live, and how things are changing, how things are built. So we could be very well seeing completely different environments to what we live in now. So how's that going to impact on things? We don't know if there's going to be massive impact from sort of climate change and stuff like that. That could again have a massive impact on how our environment changes. What impact will that have on us and how we develop, how we reproduce, etc. And we could have this could all play a significant role in the genetic drift as well. So genetic drift is definitely going to change because as we move around, as we travel more, we mix more, populations move, we have various different diaspora from one area of a country to another area of a country, and so on and so forth. So we're going to get a lot more intermingling, interbreeding of genes and mixing of genes, which is probably going to be much more advantageous as well, isn't it? So the less chance we have of keeping genes, particularly genes that could cause problems within a certain population, the better it is for us. So genetic drift is going to have a massive impact in the future as well. But science and technology is always the big thing, isn't it? So we now know that the impact genes have, and we can identify what a lot of genes are responsible for. But the question is, can we then start to control these genes? Can we start to then switch them on and off? And what kind of impact would that have? So, we've had we've mapped the human genome. You can get it done yourselves. I think it's quite pricey though. But we could be in a position in the future where we have our genomes mapped before we get married to someone, and we compare our genomes and see if there's anything that could potentially crop up. And do we want to get married to this person, potentially have children with a certain condition? It throws open a lot of sort of moral and ethical considerations, doesn't it? But this Human Genome Project, it was basically the largest biological collaborative project in the history of our species, and it started in 1990, and then they declared it was complete in about 2003. But that was only 85% of the genome that was actually mapped at that point, and it was finally fully completed in May 2021. So we have pretty much a picture of every single gene that's in our body now, where it's located, what a lot of these genes are responsible for as well. But we've also gone further than that, and the Neanderthal Genome Project was started in 2006, and they've actually got quite a high percentage of the Neanderthal genome mapped by 2013. So when we think about, obviously to map genomes and things like that, we need access to DNA. And DNA from things that have been dead a long, long time are very, very difficult to get. Because a lot of the time there's, again, environmental changes, environmental factors that influence that. You tend to find there'll be different animals that will eat away at things, weather conditions, all that kind of stuff. But they've actually managed to get quite a lot of Neanderthal DNA. And it has been found that between most modern humans outside of Africa share about 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA. So most of us, unless we're of Afro-Caribbean descent, will have at least 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA within us, because different human species way back when did interbreed and reproduce amongst each other. So there's, I don't know if anyone saw a program a couple of years ago where they managed to get DNA from a woolly mammoth, and the plan was to implant that into an elephant's egg, and try and grow a woolly mammoth. Did anyone see it? Yeah. So that's still ongoing, but there's the potential there that it could actually bring back the woolly mammoth from extinction. But with Neanderthal DNA, it's not probably beyond the realms of science within the next sort of 20, 30 years to potentially bring back Neanderthals, which, again, it's mind-blowing to think that, but there's so many sort of ethical and moral considerations to make with that kind of thing. So although we have all this amazing knowledge and this, this kind of stuff available to us, we need to kind of rein it back a little bit and can't just go full force and try and discover everything we can. We've got to sort of remain in control a little bit. But yeah, that would be, lots of different considerations if we manage to do that. But then the future could already be here. So as humans, we have what's called trichromatic vision. So we have 3 types of cone, which are determined by the different types of opsin protein. So these cones are attuned to a specific wavelength of light, whether that's short, medium, or long, or blue, green, and red. So we've all done that visual spectrum, visual light spectrum stuff over the years. And there's some mammals that have only 2 different types of cone opsins. So they have less colour acuity, but they might have more rods. They've got better night vision and stuff like that. But there are even certain species, like the mantis shrimp, that's got 16 opsins, which are fine-tuned for different colours. So they, as well as polarised light, ultraviolet, and they can see loads of different colours that we can't even begin to imagine, really. And again, you think, what use is that to a mantis shrimp? That'd be better for us, wouldn't it? But it's one of those really, but things evolve differently. But yeah, but 16 different opsins have been found in the mantis shrimp. But it's these colours are determined by the wavelength of light that we see. So the gene that's in control of the shortwave opsin is found on the Y chromosome, where the medium and long are found on the X chromosome. And this is why men are more prone to colour blindness than women, because if we have a faulty opsin on one X, we can't compensate for it by our second X, whereas women have the 2 X chromosomes, they can compensate for that faulty X chromosome opsin. And it was the duplication of one opsin onto the X to 2 at some point during the primate evolution that allowed them to mutate freely without the loss of function, and then that's what allowed us to then acquire this new colour sensitivity. And it was thought that this happened around tens of millions of years ago, long before humans, but it's something similar is still happening now. So there have been some women that have been found to be tetraclimatic, so they can see 4 different colours, got 4 different opsins. So there's been another random chance duplication, and it's caused some women to acquire that 4th opsin on one of their X chromosomes, and it's thought to have been found in around about 1 in 8 women. So there could be women in here today that have got this extra opsin.
How would we know?
You'd have to be tested for it. You'd have to be checked. But it's an evolutionary change, isn't it? So there may be women that have better colour perception than men. And we could see, obviously, where some women will see colours, we would just see monotones. So it does ask the question of whether women will evolve better vision than men over time. Who knows? I think my wife's got better vision when it comes to noticing things that I've maybe left out or not cleaned properly and stuff like that. I'm sure many of the ladies would agree. But we could be in a position in generations down the line. It's already 1 in 8. Who knows what it's going to be 5, 6, 7 generations down the line, where women could have a much greater perception of colour than men as well. So it's always changing. It never stops. it's never necessarily getting better, but it certainly never stops evolving. So there's always going to be changes going on in the future. So, all the notes for this will be available to download from our website, so I'll send the link out for that. But there's the list of references there as well. But if it's a topic that you are interested in, then there's some books that I definitely recommend, which have kind of inspired me over the years to look into this a bit more as well. But yeah, fascinating reading if you want to sort of brush up on the subject. So